Welcome everyone to our Junior Back to School webinar. We're really excited to have you here. By way of a brief introduction, my name's Jim Wismer and I'm the director here at Ivy Experience. We're a comprehensive college prep company, so we offer services in college counseling, essay and application coaching, SAT, ACT, AP, and other standardized test prep, and academic tutoring and executive function coaching. We started as a small company in the Philadelphia area, but since we've worked with students in more than 40 states and over 20 countries, helping them to be accepted to more than 500 different colleges and universities. If you're catching the recording on YouTube, please like, subscribe, and share our content around. We do these to dispel myths and misconceptions in the college admission space, so your help in spreading that reach is invaluable. One quick housekeeping item for our live attendees. Please use the Q&A feature or the chat function in Zoom to ask your questions throughout the presentation. We'll answer them all at the end of the presentation, and we'll stick around as long as there are questions. So please do take advantage of that. Now, for personal introductions, I mentioned my name's Jim Wismer. I'm the director. What that means in practice is that I oversee all of our test prep and school subject tutoring here at Ivy Experience, and I speak with most of our new families about whatever they're interested in. I also organize all of our webinars, so all your Zoom reminders to join the webinar came from me. And I'll pass it over to Alyssa to introduce herself.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Alyssa Coltrain. I am the Director of College Admissions for Ivy Experience, which means I work with students on pretty much everything that is not academic or SAT and ACT tutoring, including college advising from 8th grade on, career and major counseling with the Highlands Ability Battery, and serving as a essay and application coach and project manager for our many juniors and seniors working their way through this process. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. And Kevin?
Absolutely. So my name is Kevin Trudel. It's good to meet everybody. I am a senior college admissions specialist here at Ivy Experience, which means my role, I primarily work with seniors and rising seniors on their college applications, both in terms of the college counseling component of it and with their applications. I also do a little bit of work working in advising underclassmen as to sort of what their next best steps are going to be through their journey in high school.
Thank you. Okay, so we like to start our webinars by reminding families of what is in their control in the college admissions process. So in college admissions, there are all kinds of things that are not in your control, institutional priorities on the part of colleges and your zip code and your demographic information, all of which will factor into the decisions that colleges eventually make. But these 6 things on this slide here are what we're going to focus on tonight because they're the things a student can really focus their time and attention and energy into to help themselves in this process. So I won't elaborate too much on this slide. It's probably very familiar by now if you've been to our webinars before this one because it's in almost all of them. But without further ado, we're going to jump into the one that is kind of the most immediate with back to school time, and that is grades and academic rigor. So grades and the academic rigor of your coursework tend to be the most important of the 5 factors. And that's because they show your performance in high school over time. Generally speaking, junior year grades are going to be the most heavily scrutinized grades by college admissions officers. But your grades, throughout the rest of high school matter too, and specifically your beginning of senior year grades. We sometimes see, students discount those or think they don't matter quite so much. You can talk to your peers that are a year ahead of you right now, and they will tell you that those senior year grades are going to be reported to colleges. So make sure, you keep that in mind. The biggest misconception we tend to see on the part of families is understanding the environment of high school grades right now and quite how different it is from parents when you were in high school to now. So the data on the slide here is the percentage of college freshmen in the US who have at least an A minus average from high school. So about 85% of college going students had at least an A minus average in high school. And this tends to surprise people when I tell them, when I ask people to guess, they usually guess something closer to 50%, or even less than that potentially. And I say this because it's really important to understand that a student who gets, almost all A's with a handful of B's, Those are pretty standard grades these days. Those aren't kind of the sign of an excellent student, and that's not to say that a student who gets them isn't doing excellent work. It's just that the grades themselves aren't showing as a differentiating factor for that student. To illustrate this point, I've got some admissions data here from the University of Pittsburgh. I use it because one, it's my alma mater. Two, as a Philadelphia area company, this is a Pennsylvania state school and a lot of our students apply. But you can see that the average GPA of a University of Pittsburgh freshman from the most recent year they published data is 4.06, over a 4.0. And almost 60% of their freshmen had over a 4.0 in high school. So I say this because, great grades in college admissions, they are no longer something that can really be a differentiating factor for students. Largely, they are sort of a bar you have to cross. Now, when it comes to grades, I understand that not everyone has a smooth transition to high school and that, we all run into bumps in the road in our kind of personal and academic life. So one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that college admissions officers do care about the order your grades came in, not just what they average out to in an overall GPA. In other words, showing a trajectory of improvement and growth and maturity over time is really valuable. We mentioned that junior year grades are the most important. That's because that's the last full year sample size that your colleges will have before you show up on campus. Your junior year self is more similar to your college self than your freshman year self was. And so if freshman year you had a really tough time, transitioning to high school, had some kind of health emergency that caused grades to slip, that's okay. And you can just kind of take the opportunity presented by junior year to improve upon that. One thing to consider as we get into junior year and students' kind of plans and ambitions for the future tend to solidify a little more is that major specific grades might be kind of more closely scrutinized. This would be especially true for STEM applicants. Your grades in math and science courses are generally going to kind of count more than grades in other courses. Of course, grades are all going to count, so I don't mean to say that any grades wouldn't be scrutinized. But let's talk about what this actually means for kind of how to put yourself on the right foot here at the beginning of the school year. The first thing I recommend you do is consider your last year's performance. So if math was a real struggle last year, you want to be ready for that this year and come into your math course with a plan for success. Talk to your teacher early and say, "Hey, math's a struggle for me. I may need extra support." You want to consider your finals, and this is going to sound kind of crazy for me to tell you in August to be thinking about your final exams in May and June. But the reason that I say this is because final exams in APs, they're structured differently for different courses. So you might be in a course where, oh, well, the teacher says that, the midterm is cumulative, but then the final exam is only cumulative from the midterm on for that second half of the year. If that's the case for you, you just want to know that, like, how long do I need to retain this information to be able to, perform well on those AP exams? Likewise, you might be in a school where you get a year-long course, and the first half of the year is, let's say AP government. The second half of the year is AP microeconomics or AP macroeconomics. And if that's the case, you're going to have to retain things you learned in the first half of the year and then didn't think about for months into an AP exam in May. So you just want to be thinking about kind of your retention plan for these things when you're organizing your time and figuring out how well do I need to learn this as I go. The better you learn things along the way, the less work you will have to do this spring to prepare for these exams. I can't tell you how many requests we get like a week out from an AP exam saying, "Hey, we need a couple tutoring sessions for AP US history." And, the tutor enters the session and realizes that the student has, massive knowledge gaps across the whole school year, and we have a week to do something about it. That's not a great position to put yourself in if you're trying to succeed on that exam. And AP exams have become more kind of used in admissions than ever before. So, really important thing to keep in mind. If you find that you're struggling in one of your courses, step one is always reach out to your teacher for extra help. Often teachers make themselves available before school, at lunch, after school, free periods, etc. Teachers are generally very willing to work with students who want to make the time to make sure that they're doing well in those courses. If that's not working for you for some reason, I always recommend reaching out to friends to study. I always say I'm a lifelong tutor. I was always the friend that helped other friends study, but that was my favorite way to study in school, was to teach the material to someone else. When you teach something, you know that you know it really well. So you'll find that if you ask one of your friends who's doing really well in a class to help you, you're actually helping them study too. So you shouldn't feel like you're imposing, and your friend can always say no if they don't have the time or something like that. But I do recommend reaching out, to your peers to kind of group together and help one another out. When that fails, that's when you really want to consider when tutoring comes into the equation. So when we work with students on academic subject tutoring, we're not going to focus purely on content review, but we also want to make sure that they're forming, habits that are going to help them learn to study in the long run and be successful in the course, a future version of the course where they don't have the tutor. We do think about, we're test prep tutors and we're academic tutors here. So we're always thinking about test taking strategies, even when students are doing academic tutoring. We want to know, in other words, this knowledge that you're trying to absorb, how are you actually going to have to reproduce it to get credit, right? We want to know, are we writing essays with this? Are we answering multiple choice questions? And we want to make you a master of the format while we make you a master of the content. Either way, I recommend starting sooner rather than later. We've already seen our first kind of rush of academic tutoring requests come in as students realize, wait a minute, I have summer work to do. And there are 2 weeks of summer left for students in the Northeast. The second rush of students we'll see is in October when people get their first unit test back in math. And that's when people get those, poor grades on the first test and realize, oh shoot, I think I need some help. If you can identify the need before then you can avoid having that bad grade stick, in your final grade calculation for the year. So recommend trying to intervene as soon as you can, whether that's working independently with a teacher, study group, or tutoring. Now, for some students, it's not so much about the specific subject at hand, it's about managing their workload more broadly. And so we have launched this fall executive function coaching to help students with these skills. So, executive function and coaching is going to help students build organization, motivation, resilience. Now, these sound like very soft and nebulous terms, right? These are soft skills that are really important, but all of these soft skills are really clusters of concrete skills. So, organization, for instance, might mean a student doesn't know the nuts and bolts of how to actually organize their time, use a planner. Now, parents, you might have been like me in high school and had to write things down in a physical book to keep track of your assignments. Obviously, the strategies a student uses now are going to look quite a bit different than that. But the point is that these are built of real skills that students can learn and practice to build the foundations and the building blocks of these soft skills that are going to allow them to succeed. So our coaching is individualized to the student. There might be a student who struggles with, for instance, the concept of goal setting. How do you actually make a goal, track your progress to it, and understand if you've achieved it or not, or kind of what you need to do to achieve it? It might be a student who needs help figuring out how do I actually study to memorize information. Students are often not taught how studying actually works. It differs quite a bit from subject tutoring because we're not really focused on the content at hand. We're focused more on equipping students, more of a teach you how to fish. Here's how you operate the fishing rod, and you can go find your fish in the classroom using these skills. Sorry about that very tortured metaphor. Um, so those are the two main ways we can help in the classroom with academic subject tutoring, if the subject is the issue, and executive function coaching, if it's more about the process. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to my colleagues to talk to you about letters of recommendation.
Yes. So when it comes to letters of recommendation, this is one of the moments where we like to pause, not just to give Jim a chance to grab a sip of water before he soldiers into talking to us about test prep, but like your grades, letters of recommendation are a factor that are forged in the classroom by building relationships with teachers. So, letters of recommendation are used by admissions officers to get a third party insight into students from their educators, from their counselors. They can see the grades and the rigor on a transcript. They may have SAT or ACT scores, but they want to see what type of student is this person in a classroom? Do they ask good questions? Do they work well with others? Are they resilient when they encounter a subject that they aren't, comfortable with, or a test grade that they weren't expecting? Who are they as members of an academic community? So when it comes to those letters, typically students are going to ask 1 to 2 teachers and 1 counselor, your school counselor. These teachers should ideally be a junior year core subject teacher. And when we say a core subject teacher, we mean math, science, history, foreign language, and English. For those of you who love your French class, yes, that counts. It qualifies as a core subject. But more importantly, even than that, these should be teachers who care about this student, who know this student, who know who they're going to be in a classroom, and who will go to bat for the student and write a detailed and specific letter that is going to serve them well. In some ways, that those relationships can be easier to build. Your students are in the classroom on a day-to-day basis, talking to teachers, maybe reaching out for help after that first bad unit test in math, like Jim mentioned, but they may not see your school counselor on a day-to-day basis. So this is also a relationship to think about cultivating, not only for letters of recommendation, but later on down the line, as students start to fill out applications, they'll have lots of questions that school counselors can help them with. For some schools, there are opportunities to provide a optional third recommender, sometimes from a mentor, sometimes from another teacher. This is something that we really only recommend if that teacher or mentor would illustrate something about the student that wouldn't show up anywhere else on the application. And I think, Jim, you actually have a pretty classic example of a great time to use that optional recommender, right?
That's right, yeah. So my main extracurricular activity in high school was track and field, but I was JV freshman, sophomore, junior year. I ended up being the second highest scorer on the team senior year, but on college applications, you don't get credit for the spring of senior year because it hasn't happened yet. So I asked my track coach for a letter of recommendation because there were many ways in which I was a leader on the track team, even though all it would have said on my application was JV, JV, JV for those 3 years. I was running the fully automatic timing system at our meets. I was overseeing the weight room. Was it legal then? I don't know, but people cared a lot less about what was legal in schools then. And so I was given a lot of kind of leadership opportunities on the team. The coaches trusted me with a lot of responsibility. But if I were to write in the additional information section of my Common App that, no, trust me, I'm the best JV track and field athlete ever, that would fall totally flat. I needed third-party validation of that insight from an adult, and I had a great relationship with my track coach, and he was also my freshman year history teacher. So the stars kind of aligned for it to make a lot of sense for me to use that letter because he could offer insights that I just could not have gotten into my application in any other way.
All right. Perfect. So we have our 1 to 2 core subject teachers. We've weighed whether or not we're asking our track coach for that optional letter of recommendation. The question then becomes, when do we ask? You start building these relationships now, or for some students who may have teachers that they had in sophomore year or freshman year, you've started building these relationships already, but you're going to want to ask for letters of recommendation before the end of junior year. And we're going to do that for 2 reasons. One, sometimes certain teachers are known for writing spectacular letters of recommendation, or they have a lot of junior year courses, and they may cap the number of letters of recommendation they write in order to do their best work for each student who asks them. So asking before the end of junior year gives you your best shot of making sure you are one of those students that they're doing their best work for. The other reason is similar. We want a teacher who is writing your student's letter of recommendation to have time to do their best work. And many teachers use the summer when they are not distracted by classroom prep, by grading, by all of the other important things that teachers do in order to draft those letters of recommendation. So giving them the time to do this can help set your student up for success. So we ask by the end of this academic year for our juniors, if by the time you come back to school as a newly minted senior, you haven't heard back from them, this is the opportunity to politely remind them and say thank you again in advance for the letter that you're going to get. So before the end of junior year, we're going to ask, how are we going to ask? This is something that a student wants to ask in person. It is the most polite way to do it. It's the most respectful way to do it. It's also typically these are junior year core subject teachers, so it is often the most convenient way to do it. Catch them after class briefly. But then everyone does better when things are put in writing. I'm sure that is one of the skills we teach in executive functioning. Once you have asked in person, follow up with a friendly email where you identify the schools you're applying to, any relevant deadlines that are coming up, as well as offering to provide a resume or a brag sheet, anything that the teacher might need in order to help them to help you. I mention a brag sheet here. It is a collection of accomplishments, experiences, skills. Many schools will ask students to fill this out in order to help not just teachers, but their counselors write the best letter that they can be. So we're going to depart the classroom a little bit and move into standardized testing. And Jim, I'll hand that back to you.
Now we get to the most exciting part of the presentation, at least for me, standardized testing. I like to start the standardized testing part of this kind of holistically and thinking like, why do colleges use standardized test scores at all when so many of them are optional and it's very confusing about how optional really is. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of all of that, let's just talk about like, well, what are these test scores actually used for? So colleges care a lot about data. And they want to predict which students are going to be successful on their campus so that they can admit students who are going to, graduate, become productive alumni, possibly donate, and be great walking advertisements for their school in the future. Now, to do that, a standardized test score from the SAT or ACT at selective colleges has been repeatedly shown to be the most predictive factor of which students will have a high college GPA. And that's the number one reason standardized test scores are used. It's more predictive than a high school GPA, largely due to grade inflation, because with grade inflation comes grade compression, where grades just aren't all that different from one another anymore. But of course, grades and test scores taken together are going to be more predictive than either of them alone, and colleges don't look at these things in a vacuum. So they're taking that test score in a holistic context. It's part of a holistic review process that's going to consider everything else as well. A test score also allows colleges to compare a student with their local context. So with your high school transcript travels something called a school profile. That'll be information about your high school, including an average SAT or ACT score for your school, including which AP tests or which AP courses are offered, is the IB curriculum offered, and other information about your high school, what colleges students from your last year at your high school were accepted to, percentage of students that go on to a four-year university. It's useful context for an admissions officer, especially if you were to apply from Philadelphia to some small school in California. They might not get a lot of applicants from your high school every year, so it's helpful for them to get a little snapshot of, hey, what is this student's environment like? Now, let's talk about test score policies. And there are basically three, but one of these is really an umbrella term for like a billion different ways to consider this. So test required and test blind are the two straightforward ones. Test required means you must submit a test score as part of your application. So University of Georgia, the Florida State System, MIT, Georgetown, all of the Ivy League schools now. Columbia was the last one to switch back to required recently. And these schools will require scores. Generally, they're going to be some of the most selective schools in the country, like MIT, Georgetown, the Ivies, Stanford, Caltech, etc. Or they're going to be large state schools, generally clustered in the South, but not always, because Ohio State also requires scores. Then on the test blind end of things, you're going to see the University of California system and California State system. So that's actually about 23 colleges because California is massive and very populous. It includes UCLA, Berkeley, et cetera, but it's just those two systems, the University of California or UC system and Cal State. Um, then you have test optional, where you get the kind of middle 80% of colleges and universities. And when it comes to test optional, it's really important to know that test optional doesn't mean the same thing everywhere. Test optional really means that a college will accept your application fee and process your application, whether it includes a test score or not. They tell you nothing about your likelihood of success with or without a test score. And there are some test optional schools where over 70% of the students who are admitted are submitting test scores. Duke's a great example of this, and I think a really great example of this because Duke is also a big time Division One athletics school. And so the students who aren't getting in for sports who are being admitted test optional, that percentage is probably even lower than the 30% overall who would be admitted without a test score, right? When we take out athletes and things like that. Then you have colleges that are admitting fewer than 30% of their students with test scores, and these colleges are really devoted to test optional admissions. So these would include University of Washington, locally in the Philadelphia area. Temple falls into this category. A lot of the smaller state schools, not your flagships, but your smaller state schools would fall into this bucket as well. So let's talk kind of practical advice because, of course, at this point in August of junior year, we don't have college lists where we can go up and look, hey, these are exactly the schools I'm interested in. These are their testing policies. And so we can make a testing plan according to that. We have to keep our options somewhat open. So the important things to know are that a strong test score is just as helpful as it's always been, whether a college is test optional or not. The only exception to that would be if all you cared about was, public universities in California. If that were the case, your AP scores, by the way, would still matter. They call it test blind, but it's really not all tests. They will consider your APs. The strong test score still helps you, and the more selective the colleges that you're interested in are, the more important it is to have that strong test score. One, because so many of those highly selective colleges require them, and two, because you want every possible point you can get in your favor when we're talking about, sub 15% acceptance rate schools. When you have that test score, you're going to have more options, both for college choice, because you can apply to the required schools, and because you're going to have a better chance of success at the schools that are test optional in most cases. And also, you'll have access to more merit scholarships. Many, even test optional schools, have scholarships that are reserved only for students with test scores. Last point here is important as well. If you are a student for whom the amount of time and effort it would take for you to, get that strong test score would just not be worthwhile. It would detract from your ability to keep up with your courses and detract from your mental health and your ability to do the extracurricular activities that are meaningful to you that we're going to learn more about in a little bit. Then in that case, that's when you consider maybe, planning to go test optional. But I would say before you do that, everyone should go into these tests with kind of an open mind and explore them at least. What we do to explore them is something called diagnostic testing. So, my advice for any student starting off this test prep process is to try a diagnostic SAT and ACT and compare the scores on those two. This will give you a sense of where you'd expect to score on both tests and which of the two tests is better for you. The most common question I've been asked over my now over a decade long career in the test prep world is it better to take the SAT or the ACT? Do colleges prefer the SAT or the ACT or some version of that, right? And the answer is it's better to take the test that you can submit a higher score on. The only thing that matters is which one you can do better on. There are no colleges that prefer the SAT over the ACT or the ACT over the SAT. There are no, majors where they care more about SAT or ACT. It is just a matter of which test you can score higher on. And you say, but the ACT has a science section. I want to go into science. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. The SAT has plenty of science content on it. They just don't isolate a science score. Um, so when you take a diagnostic test, the first thing we're going to look at when we evaluate results from this is do we have a big head start on one test or the other? If we do, then it's kind of obvious which test we should focus on. The second thing we're going to do is if those scores are closer together, look with a more nuanced view of, well, what format did the student prefer? Where do we see the strengths and weaknesses, and how do students with that kind of profile tend to improve on both tests in our experience? And then we make a recommendation for which test we think will yield better results in the long run if it's not so clear which one's better right now. Now, the best time to take diagnostic testing is by the end of 10th grade because then you know in advance. But they say that the best time to plant a tree is 10 years ago and the second best time is right now. So the best time to take a diagnostic test is now. A lot of students, what we recommend is that they take it around PSAT time this fall. And what it's really going to depend on is when you intend to take the SAT or the ACT. So, generally, what we recommend for students who've finished Algebra 2 and Geometry or the equivalent courses in an integrated math course, if your school's on integrated math, just email me your school and your course title, and I'll let you know if you have all the math you need for the SAT or ACT yet. But if you've completed all of that by the end of 10th grade, I usually recommend testing for the first time in the fall of junior year because spring of junior year is the busiest academic time of high school. You're probably taking more, AP or IB exams if your school offers them. You're taking your most challenging course load yet. You're entering leadership positions in your extracurricular activities where you have more demands on your time that way. So it tends to be a really tough time for students to get test prep done. We see our lowest homework compliance from our students in May and June of junior year for sure when it comes to their test prep homework. So the idea is the earlier you can knock it out junior year, the better. But if you're taking that Algebra 2 or Geometry or equivalent course during your junior year, then you want to wait to take the test officially for the first time for the end of the year because you want to basically make sure you get all that math through the classroom before you really take the test. So for those students, what we'd recommend is take the PSAT in October when your school offers it. And then from there, take a practice ACT that we can compare to that. And we'll have another webinar in late September. The PSAT is offered in October, where it'll be more explicitly like all about test prep planning and timelines and things like that. But I'm going to go over some of the basics of test prep planning now for everyone, just to kind of get our feet under us for the school year. So, test option number one is the SAT. It's now digital. Students take it on a computer. Basically, there are four sections, two for reading and writing, two for math. The biggest differentiators of the SAT relative to the ACT are the limitations of the annotation tools, because you can take the ACT on paper and pencil on a piece of paper. You can do anything to annotate that test, whereas in a digital application, you can only do what the program is programmed to let you do. The verbal questions on the SAT tend to be more challenging. There are passages in older forms of English from like the 1800s and 1700s. There's poetry. These are things you're not going to see on the ACT, which is relatively straightforward prose from the 2000s. And then there is adaptive scoring on the SAT, and I'm just going to give a brief overview of how that works. Every student's first module, whether it's reading and writing or math, both work the same. First module is of equal difficulty for every test taker. Your performance in that first module dictates whether you get an easier second module or a harder second module. And your performance in that second module combined with your performance in the first module dictates kind of where on the overall score curve you're spat out. Now, this is represented as a spectrum because it is possible to overlap. Like if you do really well in the easier second module or really poorly in the harder second module, you can have a higher or lower score. So there is no like hard cutoff with these things. It's more of a spectrum. But generally speaking, the goal for students is to test into the harder second module and have access to those higher scores. So that's going to be our goal for students. The adaptive scoring can sometimes mess with students mentally, which is why I list it as a challenge, even though it shouldn't really impact your test taking at all because your goal is just to get as many questions right as you can. The ACT. So what does this look like? And usually our clients are a little less familiar with the ACT. They now call it the enhanced ACT. Enhanced because the science section is now optional, which students like better, of course. Now, the required sections of the ACT are English and reading, and those are going to be akin to the reading and writing section of the SAT, and then a math section. And you have an optional science section and an optional writing section. The optional writing section of the ACT, don't even consider taking it. It is useless for admissions purposes. Colleges do not care about it one bit. So just don't take it. Save your 40 minutes and go home early. The science section, I say take it on a diagnostic test, and then you make an informed decision about whether your prep plan and actual testing should include science based on, was that a strength or a weakness? It's optional, which means it can help you. The challenges of the ACT relative to the SAT are timing. The ACT gives you more questions in less time. Fatigue, because the ACT gives you more questions in less time. It's less known to students who might have already taken a PSAT in 10th grade and they're a little familiar with the SAT format. And then variance, because they shrunk the ACT, it's not adaptive, and so scores can be a little bit volatile. There are also, with the way that the experimental questions are worked into the ACT, scores can swing a little bit more. I'm not going to explain that. If someone wants to know the details of why, ask in the Q&A. But basically, you can see a slightly higher swings one way or the other on the ACT in terms of a score on any given day. And the scoring's out of 36. So each of these sections will be scored out of 36 and then averaged together. The science section's given its own score out of 36 and it just stands alone. It's not factored into your overall score. Test dates. So I bring up these test dates mainly because I want to just kind of talk through how to set up a prep plan. So I generally recommend that students test for the first time August, September, October of junior year, or essentially just by the December test date at least. I put up the dates for senior year because these are important bookends to consider when you're making your prep plan. December is the last test date that is going to be accepted for most colleges' application deadlines. Typically, they're around New Year's, and so if you want that score to be in time to be considered as part of your application, it needs to be done by December at most colleges. For early action or early decision deadlines for colleges, the the orange test dates here are going to be the last test dates available. So for the SAT, August, September, or October. For the ACT, September or the July of junior year if you're trying to wait until after the school year. So the idea here is that you just want to know, hey, what's my deadline for having all of this done? Because keeping that in mind can, help you figure out if I'm going to retest, when should I do it, and things like that. We often get the question, what test dates have the easiest curves? And it's typically in the context of someone saying, well, wait a minute, why would a junior want to take the test in the fall? Because that's when the seniors take it and they break the curve. Or it's harder to score well when you're competing against students who are a year older than you. Not true, mainly because the SAT's curving takes the student age into account and it's based on a hypothetical curve. They know that, yeah, they only have juniors taking the test in March, and they're going to have a way higher proportion of seniors taking the test in October. They account for that in the way that they scale the test. So these are professional psychometricians. This isn't something that, a mom Facebook group has cracked that College Board can't possibly, figure out. It's a situation where you're going to see a lot of misinformation on the internet about it, but really there are test dates that have easier and harder curves. A lot of it comes down, though, to individual variance. So, for instance, on any given ACT, you might see comma rules tested on anywhere from, let's say, 6 to 9 questions. Well, if you are bad at comma rules, you're sure hoping it's 6. If you're good at comma rules, you're sure hoping it's 9, right? And that kind of thing is going to tend to matter more than like the overall curve of the test on any given day. Now, diagnostic testing, I mentioned it earlier. We offer free diagnostic testing to anyone, and we're going to send out a recap email for this webinar. The recap email will include instructions for diagnostic testing. I know many of the people here have already done it with us, and they're probably like, Jim, can you move on? We already did this part. We had a call with you directly and talked about our results. I know, I'm sorry. Thanks for sticking with me. But I would really recommend this as a step for anyone who hasn't yet. Many families ask, well, can't we just take both? The yes, of course you can, and you get to choose what you send to colleges. So if one doesn't go well, then you don't have to send it. However, my main piece of advice here, Test prep is an investment of a student's time and energy and a family's money into trying to get the best result possible. And when you split that investment in two different directions, you're going to get partial growth in two different directions. I really recommend putting all of that time, effort, and money into one direction. That's where you're going to tend to see your best results. Now, thank you all for sticking with me through standardized testing. I'm pleased to report for all of you that we can now switch to more fun things like extracurricular activities.
Yeah, no, I will say I love talking about extracurriculars because it's one of the things that when students talk about it, they light up. And extracurriculars do serve an important process as important part of the admissions process. Having worked in admissions, I can definitely say it's a great indicator because it's the one place I can see in a student's application what sort of passions they have and how they might fit into different communities on my campus through how they spend their time, right? So it's colleges are looking towards your extracurriculars because they want to understand that, like, hey, you're someone who pursues their interests and are not sitting at home doom scrolling all day. Now, with that said, as far as like how this is going to show up in an application down the line, right? In the common application, the most common application portal that students use as part of this process, you do have up to 10 activity slots. So you can keep that in mind, and you have those slots. You might as well use them and try to pursue different passions to fill those up when you ultimately apply. Now, okay, so extracurriculars are important, right? We got that. How can you, as a student, right, engage? What can you do to kind of fill up those slots that are ultimately go in your application, right? And ultimately, we value and we think and we truly believe, and they've seen the results, that authenticity is the best approach here. These activities are an opportunity to grow, to pursue different passions, whether they're intellectual, personal, or anything else. You can learn a lot of things doing a job. You can learn a lot of things doing art, right? You can learn a lot of things playing a sport. So they have inherent value. And pursuing your passion versus just going for the impressive thing also means a student is more likely to have depth in the activity because they're enthusiastic about it, right? They're more likely to try new things and to engage in a meaningful way as part of these applications. So it's something we encourage. The other thing I will say regarding how you engage and what you should do is the other reason we emphasize pursuing your passion over just going for the impressive thing is because it's honestly an easier way to stand out, right? If you are trying to be an officer in a Red Cross club, there's thousands of Red Cross clubs across the country. There are thousands of officers in those Red Cross clubs. It's a little bit harder to have something that sticks in a memory of an admissions officer or that demonstrates a specific passion, right? When you're in that pool of people versus pursuing your own individual passions, right? So I guess, as far as like how, what you can do, how you can engage there, think about what you're doing. Don't limit yourself to stuff that is just the school club. You can pursue your own passions. You can found your own esports club. You can woodwork and sell your pieces. Anything counts. And it's important to be authentic as part of this process, right? Ultimately, we live in 2026, right? This is increasingly a world where everything is homogenized through algorithms. It's not a fun place to be, right? People put a lot of their schoolwork into, people are increasingly using large language models, right? But here's the thing. Extracurriculars are an important place because extracurriculars are where you live your life, right? AI can't live your life for you. AI can't show up and do that woodworking project for you, right? It is where you live your life. So instead of being like everybody else, right? When everybody's zigging, you zag yourself, right? That's the important thing with activities. And we do advise students on that front, both through individual student advising with underclassmen, and we will and sort of helping students figure out perhaps passion projects for themselves to make the best use of their summers. Now, that is a little bit about extracurriculars. I'm going to throw things back to Alyssa now to talk a little bit about another factor, building your college list.
Yes. So building your college list is one of those factors under your control. Often we mark this one with a little bit of an asterisk because although grades, rigor, SAT scores, letters of recommendation, extracurriculars, essays and applications, which Kevin's going to tell us about a little bit later on, These impact your chances of acceptance at a given school or university. A carefully constructed college list affects the options that you have available to you at the end of this process, where you are able to select between colleges and universities that are going to fit the student, allow them to thrive, be happy, be successful. So it is a really crucial part of this process. But I also want to briefly pause here and tell our potentially anxious juniors up there, you do not need to have a fully developed college list yet. You do not have to have any college list at all at this point. Now is a great time to be thinking about this. I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes helping you think it through, but you don't need to have a college list yet. When myself and Kevin and our fellow essay and application specialist Jordan Holm work with students, we often tell them we need 4 colleges from you by June of junior year so we can begin thinking and strategizing about how you're going to tackle school-specific essays this summer. But you don't need a college list yet. That being said, when it comes to building one, there are approximately 4,400 degree granting institutions in the United States. About half of those institutions offer 4-year degrees. Um, so we're at 2,200. And for the vast majority of students, there are going to be dozens of schools with strong, interesting programs in your major of choice: business, biology, chemistry, psychology. For many students, a major isn't going to be defining. If you want to be a pilot or a marine biologist, call us, we'll give you your college list. But for many students, you're going to have to seek out other ways to limit your list. And it's okay to limit your list by things that may seem superficial. You're not just going to this college or this university to take classes. 9 times out of 10, you're going to live there. This is going to be a place that will be your home. So, as we start to define those components that dictate how we build a good college list, we talk about this idea of match and fit. And there are really 4 components here. And I'm actually going to go out of order a little bit from what's on the slide and talk about the financial component first. Um, College is an expensive investment. This is a conversation that families should have first and foremost and define what their comfort zone is or is not when it comes to the ability to afford certain schools. Have that conversation first so no one is falling in love with a school that is ultimately not going to be tenable. Have that conversation first. It's always a little uncomfortable, but it's better to do it now when schools are abstract than later on when there are, real schools in the mix. So we're going to talk about that first one first. Next is going to be social. What type of school environment, what type of school community matters to you? Do you want a school with Greek life? Does it absolutely matter to you that you have the opportunity to row or to play ultimate frisbee? Do you want to be in a really big school or a really small school? All of these things will affect how a student's day to day works out. The next is going to be physical. Do you want to be in a city? Not in a city? Do you want to be in a college town? Does the idea of trying to figure out the logistics of packing your entire freshman year dorm on a plane to go to school in California sound a little horrifying? Do you want to be far enough away that your parents can't show up without calling you first? These physical elements are going to matter. And the last is going to be academic. You know, although many schools have strong programs and many majors, There might be a specific focus for a major that interests you. There might be other components, co-op programs, study abroad opportunities that matter to you as a student. And these are the things that help you determine that ideal college profile. Once we have this together, the other thing we're going to think about is this idea of schools that are reaches, targets, or likely schools. Um, some of you may have heard the term safety school. We tend to use likely school instead. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But if that's the term you're more familiar with, when I say likely school, that's what I mean. So we're going to use sort of an SAT score or an ACT score as a rough equivalent here. A reach school is a school that a student is unlikely to be accepted to. And this is likely going to be schools where a student's SAT or ACT score is below that 25th percentile of their admitted enrolled students, or a school where the acceptance rate is less than 20%. Harvard isn't a likely school for anyone, even if you have a perfect score. A target school is going to be where a student's grades, rigor, standardized test matches the average applicant. They fall within that middle 50th percentile. And a likely school is going to be where a student academically exceeds the average admitted student there in grades, in rigor, and in standardized test scores. And I know that was a lot of technicalities here, so we're going to use the of Vermont here as an example, who, much to the joy of our current rising seniors who are often writing supplement essays, got rid of their essay this year. So many of our students have a bit less writing to do during the tail end of the summer. So the University of Vermont's mid 50th percentile, so the middle 50% of all admitted enrolled students, they have an SAT score that ranges from 1300 to 1430, ACT from 29 to 33, and an average GPA of about 3.8. We're going to take a quick peek at those acceptance rates, both in and out of state, and go, all right, this isn't automatically a reach school. We have an acceptance rate that's over 15%. So in this case, for student A, they have a GPA that exceeds that average, an SAT score in the 75th percentile or higher. This school is going to be a likely school for them, and so on and so forth. For student B, who falls in and around that middle point, this would be a target. And for student C, who falls below that 25th percentile, this would be a reachier school. And I mentioned that I was going to come back to this idea of likely schools. And the reason why we don't call likely schools safety schools is because your likely schools should be the most thoughtfully chosen schools on your list. And they're not exciting. These are schools where you are at or above the 75th percentile. But everyone sleeps better when your quote unquote worst choice is actually still a really good choice. So we advise families to make sure that you have two or three of these insurance policy schools where you would be truly happy. It takes a lot of stress out of the process to do this. And it also can be a great way to bring other factors into play, merit scholarships or honors colleges. Um, Jim mentioned earlier that he went to University of Pittsburgh, which I think was one of your likely schools, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. But I wanted to study philosophy, so I needed to take the full ride that they gave me.
Yes, for a similar reason, I went to a small private school. My parents went, we have put aside enough money to pay for like a state school education. You can go anywhere you want, but the extra money has to come from somewhere. And I went to Dickinson College, one of my likely schools, because they offered me a merit scholarship that was sizable enough that I was able to go to Dickinson for about the cost of going to Pitt. And I asked Jim about this because our likely schools were wildly different. I would have been miserable and overwhelmed in a city, at a university as big as Pitt. I wanted someplace small. I wanted to be the big fish in the little pond who could show up and just have like freewheeling conversations with my English teachers. So choosing these thoughtfully can be a huge part of your college process. So we've got those 2 to 3 likely schools, but where does the rest of your list come from? And how many schools should be on that list? Um, our students tend to apply on average between 8 to 12 schools, but you may hear, out on mom Facebook groups that you should have a balanced list, 3 targets, 3 likelies, 3 safeties. You should always have 2 to 3 likely schools. But after that, the composition of the rest of your list is up to you. For some high achieving students, that less than 15% acceptance rate caveat I mentioned may mean that the schools that should be your targets by your stats are still reaches. You can have a reach heavy list. Just be aware and be prepared that that means you may get told no more often than not. But if you thoughtfully chosen your likely schools, that's still going to be okay. The other thing to keep in mind here, and this will be a great segue into handing this off to Kevin for college essays, is think about the amount of work required to apply. Many schools will have school-specific supplement essays, not the University of Vermont anymore. But when a school requires a school-specific essay, that means it's extra work to apply. When a school doesn't, it makes applying easier. We had a student once who applied to 20 schools and wrote a single supplement essay. We've had school students apply to 8 schools and write 20 supplement essays. So that is something to bear in mind as you're building that college list. And Kevin, I have been alluding to essays for the past couple of minutes, so I'm just going to hand it over to you and let you take us the rest of the way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, college essays are one of the components that they're going to be considered as part of this process. It's one of those factors you can control. Now, when should you start these college essays? The shortest possible answer is early. The reason for starting early is ultimately when we advise students, we want you to have a balance between taking care of your responsibilities and still enjoying life, being able to have the time to do well in school, enjoy your junior and senior years, and to be able to get the most out of that. Now, because of that, we do advise students to take advantage of their junior year and the summer between junior and senior year to get a lot of their applications done. The reason that we do advise that is that the Common Application rarely makes changes to kind of the overall application and specifically to the essays. There's been one change to one of the 7 prompts in the past 5 years. Before that point in time, it was like another 5 years before they added or removed an essay or two. So you're talking 1 to 2 small changes every decade. So because of that, you know what those prompts are. You can start that main college essay, the Common App personal statement early. And you can also sort of begin figuring out what are some of those other materials that'll go into your Common Application as well. So that's why we advise starting early. The second reason is because, as Alyssa alluded to, there's lots of different types of essays that you'll have to write as part of this process. Yes, I referred to that personal statement, that main essay in your Common Application. But you're going to have to write all kinds of college essays as part of this process, not just that personal statement, right? Outside of that personal statement, you'll have school-specific essays that Alyssa alluded to. As far as the categories of those different kinds of college essays, there is a very common sort of why do you want to go here, or why college, or why major. supplemental essay that you may have to do, right? You may have to do an essay around, how you fit into a community or about a lived experience that you have, and how you kind of see yourself in the world. Another common application essay type is about your most meaningful activity. And then there are just things that are miscellaneous fun. So whether that's like a prompt about AI, a prompt asking you about your favorite a top 10 list or anything in between, they're just kind of some miscellaneous fun prompts. Now, the reason we bring these up is to give you a sense of the scope of what you'll have to work on. The nice thing I will say about these essay types is that these are the common essay types year in and year out, and prompts typically don't change all that much, right? So you can get started early on this piece of it as well. And doing so and on starting your essays, whether that's the personal statement, the common application, or some of these supplementals in the junior year and over the summer, means that you are living a slightly less stressful life going into senior year. Now, the main essay, the common app personal statement, it's the one we get asked about the most. And like we could do a whole webinar on just that, obviously, but to give students a little bit of a primer of like, hey, where do I start? Where do I even get some ideas from for this essay that everybody stresses out about? The topics and ideas for the personal statement tend to come from two places. The first is your resume. So those are like the activities you're involved in. Maybe you play a sport, you do a lot of volunteering, you have a job, you did a meaningful volunteer experience, or maybe you've done something like woodworking, example I gave earlier, or fishing, a skill you've developed, right, over time, that could provide some interesting brainstorming directions. The other place personal statement topics can come from are what we would call toast topics. And these are like topics you might have a dinner conversation about, right? Talking about like what your passions or hobbies are, right? Maybe some very interesting lived experiences you've had over time, maybe your family traditions or nicknames that you and your family members have for each other, right? So though personal statement topics tend to come from those two places primarily, and exploring those two areas is a great place to start for brainstorming. Now, as far as once you started thinking about what your resume toast topics are, it's one of those things that I think a common thing we get asked is there a good topic? Is there a bad topic, right? Is there something you can't say you write about, or you definitely should write about? And so here's the thing. Are there good and bad topics? Yes, but also no. Okay. So sometimes students have been told over the years that you'd want to avoid cliche topics or topics that people write about all the time. We'll give some examples here of volunteering, athletics, dance, right? But here's the thing, right? The issue isn't necessarily with a topic, writing an essay about athletics or volunteering, as an example, right? It's about how you speak about it, right? Are you defaulting to a cliche, right? Through doing this sport, I learned perseverance and we won the big game, right? That would be a cliche, right? If you have a very distinct way of viewing one of these topics, right, that are common or viewed as common, that could be a great essay, right? Maybe being a midfielder in soccer speaks to a larger value that you have about wanting to be in the middle of all the action, right? And that's how in a way you approach the different activities in your life, your relationships with your friends, your approach at your job or whatever, right? So it's one of those things that it's about how you talk about a topic, not necessarily what the topic is. And I think a final thing that students tend to be concerned about is thinking that they have to have the biggest tale of woe or the most unique thing ever, that if their topic is not about them juggling chainsaws underwater, it's not interesting enough, right? So don't worry about that. You having something distinct that allows an admissions officer to get a genuine sense of who you are as a person, how you see the world and interact with the world, is honestly where the best essays are. It's not about juggling chainsaws underwater, okay? As a final note regarding the personal statement, do not focus on the prompts. Why do we bring that up, right? Simply because, one, there is a prompt in the Common App personal statement that says write an essay on the topic of your choice. It is the most commonly selected prompt. So students get into college writing that prompt. The second reason we tell students not to focus on prompts is you can often pigeonhole yourself, right? If you're thinking about prompt about challenges, right? You may be um, not thinking about a bunch of other topics that may be much better, right? So instead, the approach we tend to take here at IB Experience in advising students is thinking about how personal statements are read and what they're used to assess, which is what a student will bring to a campus as a community member, a dorm mate, a roommate, right? And so don't focus on the prompts, focus on what is distinct, authentic about you, and communicates who you'll be on the college campus. Okay, so that is a little bit about essays. Now, I'm going to pass it off to Alyssa to speak about how we work with students on their applications, on their essays, and on everything else.
Yes. We start working with juniors beginning in November of this year. We want to give you a couple of months to settle in, get used to your classes, get through that first unit test in math before we start working in earnest. That being said, we are already booking free, no obligation initial consultations for the class of 2028 starting in that November timeframe. I know Kevin dropped a link in the chat to go ahead and book one of those. Um, we work with students from the very beginning of this process, starting with brainstorming, going all the way through outlining unlimited drafts and comments of any application that you want to work with us on, bringing essays down to the word limit, and proofreading in that process. We also work as project managers. We set deadlines, follow up, carve this huge process up into itty bitty pieces so that students don't have to worry about all of the moving parts, so that parents don't have to worry about what is or isn't getting done. And we also serve as college advisors. We can have almost any conversation you want to have about every single college admissions topic that we've mentioned today in the webinar. We often tell our students that they aren't getting rid of us until they text us a picture of them in the sweatshirt of the school that they committed to. So we really are your team from November 1st all the way through the end of this process. That being said, we also make sure that students write in their own authentic voice. Admissions officers are looking to hear from them. We encourage students to think and write independently while we provide support every step of the way, whether that's outlines, comments, revisions, or cutting it down to the word count. And that's something that we would encourage you to do, whether you do this on your own, whether you work with us or anyone else. It does need to be the student's voice and the student's work. That is truly what admissions officers are hoping to learn about in the essay. So I know we just threw an awful lot of information at you. I'm going to let Jim sort of give some takeaways of what do we do with all of this information.
So we wanted to end today with some advice for how to have productive college conversations at home because junior year is when those conversations tend to really speed up. My first piece of advice here is it can often make sense for a family to set a day and time each week or every other week for college conversations, where it's like, hey, dinner on Wednesday night, college is a valid topic of conversation. But we've heard and seen from working with so many families over the years that eventually it gets to a point where a student feels like a parent's nagging them about college, and then they're dreading every car ride and things like that, just waiting to be, bombarded with questions that are just going to spike their anxiety. And we found that if you can set some kind of boundaries around like, hey, this is the time that we're going to talk about this. If I have another question for you that pops into my head, I'm going to take note of that and talk about it at the appropriate time instead of just brain vomiting them out and then having it be a source of conflict. Um, it's important for both parents and students to understand that the other side of that equation is going to have unique insights that are valuable. For students, for instance, your parents are much more similar to college admissions officers than you are. College admissions officers are going to be adults. They're going to see the world through the eyes of an adult, not through the eyes of a high school student. So, whereas students, of course, are going to have a much better sense of what they want and what they're looking for because it is their life. I recommend, as Alyssa said, be upfront about finances and other limitations. Another common one is geography, right? If we know, hey, it's not going to be feasible to take a flight, or if there's a health situation involved and you need to be near, a major hospital, anything like that. You want to just have those kinds of limiting conversations early in the process. Limitations and constraints in the college admissions process are super valuable. I had a younger brother, and he had two things he started his college search with. He wanted a good engineering school, and he needed to be within driving distance of a ski mountain. And with those two things, he was able to limit himself down to, double digit schools as opposed to the 2,200 Alyssa told us about earlier. The problem with choosing a college is not that there aren't enough, it's that there are too many. So, having ways that you can limit things, that's actually just going to help you in this process. So don't think of the financial conversation or, a geography limiting conversation as a way to cut off opportunities. It's actually a way to start a search. It's like, great, I have a manageable list of things I can look into rather than everything under the sun. Final thing here is let's be realistic about the level of urgency of all this. If this time next year you have no idea where you want to apply to college, then yeah, that's a very serious situation that you need to remedy right away. If this time junior year you have no idea where you want to apply to college, fine. You want to establish certain ways that you can start that research process. We have recordings of webinars we've done on college research last spring. We'll do them again this spring. So if you want some practical advice, it's there for you from us. But the main thing is just that, hey, this isn't urgent yet. So don't treat everything like a five-alarm fire. Think about, hey, what are the things where we could actually help ourselves by focusing more on now? That might be something like, for instance, making sure your academics start off on the wrong foot and that you have a test prep plan in place, that you make a tentative plan for getting a coach for essays and applications if that's what you're thinking of doing. But having your full list of colleges identified at this point is not super important. So you just want to think of, treating things with the proper sense of urgency. So thank you all for your time tonight. We're going to stick around for Q&A as long as people still have questions. With that, I'll jump right into it with the first question we got. Someone did in fact take the bait when I was talking about the the ACT being a little higher variance than the SAT and why. So the main reason is that the ACT has a passage-based reading section. In other words, the SAT's reading questions, they give you a short paragraph and ask you one question about it, then a new short paragraph with one question, short paragraph, one question. The ACT gives you four longer passages that have about 9 questions apiece. And the way the experimental questions work on the ACT, a whole passage is experimental. So passage performance for a given student can vary quite a bit based on their interest level and how well they engage with a reading. Excuse me. If a reading that was really challenging for your student is the experimental reading section or is experimental reading passage, then that's great. And that's going to benefit you and you're going to score higher than you should have on that reading test. And likewise, if that reading section is, easier for your student, but it's experimental, that's going to punish them. So you tend to see some bigger swings. The other thing is time is an issue on the ACT, and if you run out of time for a passage or during a passage, and that's the experimental passage, then you didn't actually run out of time for anything that mattered. So these things can make a bigger difference on the ACT than the SAT. The SAT has experimental questions baked in, but it's just going to be one question and one short passage at a time instead of a group of 9 questions that are affected. All right. Another question we got is what are the best types of extracurricular activities in the eyes of college admissions officers? So, Kevin, since you talked to us about extracurricular activities today, could you take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in a way, it's a little bit of a trick question because, as I said, it's not there's not one silver bullet here. Not one silver bullet activity that is going to be the best thing, is going to get you assessed 1,000%, and really win the day. Instead, the best kinds of activities are ones just that generally show depth and passion. And I've had a conversation with the Duke admissions officer about how what they're looking for as part of their assessment of extracurriculars is impact instead of leadership, right? because to be fair, you can be an officer in a club that meets once a month and doesn't do anything, right? But something that you spent a lot of time on, you've exhibited a lot of passion on, you've taken maybe a lot of initiative in pursuing. That's something that says a lot about you being someone who can do a lot of things on a college campus. So the best kinds of activities are ones that have depth, where you've shown initiative, where you've pursued a passion. So, whatever that looks like, whether that you are a K-pop fan and you started a K-pop fan club, or, you just have a hobby, as I said, mentioned random examples of like woodworking or fishing, all that works as long as you have depth and you've shown passion as part of that process.
Awesome. And then we have one last question here, which is, how are colleges using AI in their admissions decisions? Alyssa, would you like to handle this one?
Sure, I can go ahead and start this off, and feel free to jump in if you are up to date on this. We've seen really a couple of different ways that AI is getting used. And one of them truly relies on the idea of an AI as a really advanced computer and processing agent, where AI can be used to help standardize transcripts, to make a transcript easier to understand for an admissions officer, to recalculate GPAs according to the, specific sauce that a given college or university wants GPAs to be calculated in, to calculate the number of times that a student has opened an email from a given college or institution, the number of, online tours they've done, and come up with a score of this is how likely this student is to attend our institution if admitted. And in many ways, this is something that colleges and universities were already doing. They were simply using predictive algorithms that didn't have fun names to do it earlier on in the process. When it comes to essays, so far the only school that has um, spoken about using AI in the essay evaluation process is Virginia Tech. They use a AI partner alongside of a human reader to sort of help process the workload. And part of this is because at Virginia Tech, actually all readers are volunteers. They draw from their faculty to read many essays and applications. So this helps lessen the workload on those volunteers. And what happens is a human and an AI will read the same application. If they come to a consensus about how those essays should be evaluated, that score stands. If for any reason there is a discrepancy, let's say me and the AI disagree about how we would evaluate this student, we're then going to get a third party, another human being, into the room to read and evaluate that. So Jim would come in and be the tiebreaker between me and the machine.
Yeah, I would say broadly speaking, most of the uses of AI in admissions are things that, 3, 4 years ago, a good old-fashioned computer program would do, and we would have just called it a computer program because it wasn't called an AI. And now it's just a little bit more efficient and requires less human input and massaging of data because the AI can organize it in a much more effective way. And then you see a few cases like things like Virginia Tech where it's getting involved to use kind of more judgment, so to speak. Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us. And if you have any questions at any point or want to speak about your student, you know where to find us. Contact information on this slide. We really appreciate you joining us, and we hope you join us for the rest of our webinars this fall. Take care. Bye-bye.